Hey guys, this is Andrew Henderson from Nomad Capitalist, nomadcapitalist.com, here in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and came across an interesting article that was shared with me by one of these investigative, reportive teams down in Australia. This article came out earlier this year, and in it, the investigative reporters, the social justice types, were bemoaning how little corporate tax many of the big companies in Australia were paying, from energy companies to financial companies to all across the board. Many of these companies were either paying zero or they turned $2 billion in revenue into $30 million in profit and then paid tax on that. This has been something that if you go to the UK, you go to Australia, you go to many of these Western English-speaking countries, you'll see people in the streets at times, protesting this or trying to hand out leaflets, saying, hey, thanks for paying more tax than Starbucks. The idea being that some of these big multinational companies are able to shift all their profits offshore, whereas you, who's paying your $5,000 or $10,000 or $20,000 in tax, is actually doing more for the country. This is an interesting thing, and I've learned, I think it's very important. If you're going to be successful at implementing your own offshore strategy, I think that all of the kind of retaliatory, taxationist, theft, libertarian type stuff is not helpful. I try and put my philosophy aside when I do this now, because I found that when you focus on purely philosophical stuff, you don't really get the results. It's easy to sit around and say, good, taxation is stupid. Doesn't really mean that you get the result that you want. That said, I think this is an interesting story because it frames the story in a way that's consumed for the general public. The general public feels like they pay a lot of taxes, even though most of them pay relatively little. The general public has been taught that they are somehow the victims of the wealthy and that they are victims of the corporations, and that everything bad that's happening to them as a result of globalization and everything else is at the hands of these big companies and as a result of wealthy business people. And the general public doesn't entirely know what wealthy business people are. I'm sure that the average person who watches our videos here on the Nomad Capitalist channel would say, this Andrew guy is really part of the problem because he's not paying his fair share. Meanwhile, they're sitting in the United States paying $1,900 in federal income tax and thinking that really does something. So the general public's been conditioned to lap this kind of stuff up. I've talked before about how if you're going to live this nomad capitalist lifestyle, there are going to be folks who don't agree with you. There are going to be folks who think that what you do is wrong. And that's just something that you have to deal with. And you have to know that in your heart what you're doing is all right. That what you're doing is legal, what you're doing is moral, and what you're doing is the natural human order of things. That we go where we're treated best, those 5 magic words. But where I find this interesting, and where I find this to be a bit troubling as well, is the idea that the general public, most people out there, have been conditioned not to try and take advantage of the benefits, not to try and go where they're treated best, but to try and drag the rest of us down like crabs in a bucket. My personal thought on corporate taxation was actually echoed in a video by a very liberal commentator on MSNBC in the US recently. Somebody sent this to me, and he basically unwittingly made the comment that corporations just pass all their tariffs and taxes and everything else onto the consumer. So I look at it and say, Starbucks paying less tax probably creates a more competitive environment. Certainly here in Cambodia, Starbucks has to be really competitive. They've got one of the best Starbucks in the world here because there are a couple really solid local chains that they've got to compete with. And so Starbucks can't afford just to sit around and rest on its laurels and just charge whatever they want. And so I think that corporate tax being low is not really the end of the world, but let's set that aside. The general public, most of the people in your country, most of the people, if you're paying tax in the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, wherever it is, people are reading this news and they're getting upset and they're saying, we've got to do something about this. They're not saying, how can we go where we're treated best? They're not saying, maybe the school system that we grew up in taught us the wrong thing. Maybe we should be looking at where else we can go for a lower cost of living, more competitive investment opportunities, better opportunities for our family, maybe another passport. The average person will never go where they're treated best. And that is the troubling thing, is that they're the ones who are setting the policy. They're the ones who vote, whether it's voting for Trump because they're angry with globalization and where their jobs are going, whether it's voting for liberals who want to come in and tax and spend. These, the moods of the general public are what is dictating what you are paying and what your tax policy is and what you're doing in your home country. For now, it's possible to leave your country and go for greener pastures and do the same thing that Starbucks and these other big companies are doing. Not exactly the same thing, but essentially get the same kind of benefits, that you can go and you can pay, whether it's 0% or a small percent, you can dramatically lower your taxes and put that money back in your pocket, do more research and development, hire more people, expand your company, or just put it back into your own lifestyle, because after all, it's your money. That's still possible. It is becoming increasingly difficult. Banks are increasingly becoming difficult to work with if you're offshore. Company formations are becoming a little bit more difficult. Getting second residencies, putting the puzzle together is increasingly becoming more difficult because some of the exit doors are closing. And that is because the general public sees stories like this. They see that Exxon pays very little tax, and then they point the finger at people like you and I and say, well, Exxon and Andrew are the same thing. Obviously, we're not the same thing. Obviously, if you're watching this, chances are you're successful. I've been fortunate to be successful. I don't think that we're in the same boat as Exxon, but that's how it's positioned. And they see these quote-unquote corporate tax dodger stories, and they start applying it to anyone who wants to leave the country must be a criminal. So I think that a couple things I take from this are, number one, you need to build your plan. You need to figure out what you need to do to get out. You need to set up your company. You need to get your bank accounts. You need to get the stuff in place, and you need to start doing it sooner than later before more of this stuff happens and more people get frustrated and more policy is made to make it difficult. But I think it's also important to keep in mind what exactly drives all this. People are angry, and they're the ones setting the rules. They're the ones voting for the people. Trump tax reform may or may not be a good thing, but I'll tell you, if you're overseas, it makes planning a bit more difficult. It makes the form filing requirements a bit more difficult for many people. Now, that can be handled with the right amount of help, but, Trump tax reform was a result, just as an example in the United States, to deal with this quote-unquote corporate tax dodging, bring more money back, bring jobs back to the United States, and if that punishes folks who want to go where they're treated best a little bit, so be it. That's the attitude of these governments, and so I think that more than ever, having your plan in place is really important, because this is what is going on out there. People are upset. They don't exactly know why. They don't really understand the situation, and they're going to point fingers at whomever they feel emotionally is responsible. Probably is you if you're doing well. It's not really your fault, but you're going to be one of the people they point fingers at, and so do keep that in mind. Subscribe to this channel. Lots more videos, lots more updates, and nomadcapitalist.com, of course, the website. Definitely go there and find out how to build your plan. Start doing the work while you can.